Well, good day to you. It is April the 5th, a mere 3 days after Trump liberated the entire world by slapping on some useless tariffs on our trading partners and allies. And if you don't feel liberated, you should. I know I do. And if you can't tell I'm being sarcastic by those statements, you don't know me very well. So let's change that. My name is Gary Willing. I run this channel, Search for Signs. I've been doing it for a few years. And what we talk about here is we talk about Maitreya and the Masters of Wisdom, about the priorities of Maitreya, what he means for humanity, the need for peace, the need for sharing, and how sharing alone will bring about peace and so forth. And I also, from time to time, share my own personal experiences with Maitreya, but I also tie it into what's going on in the world today. And that's something that's been really forefront in the news about these tariffs. And I wanted to talk about it in relation to the priorities of the teacher that have already been laid out and been laid out for decades, and how different it is from what Maitreya sees for humanity and the importance of that. But before I do that, I just want to say if you're new to this channel and you want to know more, do your own investigation. Check out some of the information on some of the websites, such as the Share International site. Link is at the very top. You want to come back and join the discussion, post a comment, let me know what you think. If you have a question or two you want to ask, post your question in the comment section, or you can email me that question to searchforsigns@mail.com. Now, there are several priorities. I can't remember if there's 6 or 7 or 8. I can't remember exactly how many priorities there are, and it doesn't really matter the number. The ones I want to talk about in this video that have already been laid out by Maitreya are the inauguration of the principle of sharing, the establishment of peace, but another one that probably won't happen for a few years to come and won't happen until those other two are in place is the free interchanges of people. How does that relate to the Trump tariffs? Okay, so Trump, of course, being the President of the United States, is acting in what he thinks is the interest of the United States, and every president is guilty of doing something to this effect, and in no way has it ever brought about peace or security. They always promise peace and security, but they never seem to fulfill on it. Why? Because the approach that the United States has been taking over the last few decades isn't going to bring about peace, because it never has. The only thing that will bring about peace and security and trust amongst nations is the principle of sharing. That's it. Maitreya puts it much simpler than I can. Without sharing, there will be no justice. Without justice, there will be no peace. And without peace, there will be no future. So where do tariffs fit into all this? Well, that's the exact opposite. That's competition. That's going to bring up, and when nations compete, they start to not trust one another. They start to perhaps not cooperate, and those kind of things. So it won't bring about trust. It won't bring about cooperation. It won't bring about a just situation amongst nations. It's never going to do that. And it's amazing how humanity will try everything but what Maitreya suggests. And if you don't believe me that sharing will bring about justice, there was one time, and I talk about it in almost every video, there was one time when we tried it, when the United States tried it. It's called the Marshall Plan. And the nations that we participated in the Marshall Plan right after World War II had, for the most part, not trusted one another, had, for the most part, been very tense amongst, there's been tension, there was tensions amongst those nations. And for the most part, from time to time, there was conflicts. There was military conflicts between those nations. Nations like Germany, France, Italy, the United Kingdom, United States, right? You can go back and look through your history books and see exactly when those nations were at war with one another. But since the Marshall Plan took place in the 40s, early 50s, ever since then, there's not been a conflict amongst those nations. And I listed out the nations in the last video to help get a better understanding of it. But those are the major players. There's other players like Luxembourg and the Netherlands and so forth. But the major players, the big boys, that were always at each other's throats, Germany, France, Italy, United Kingdom, and the United States, none of them attacked one another since we did this, since we tried it. It was, in fact, according to one of the masters, the only time the United States ever manifested love. It was when we did this, when we tried it. It happened. And even though it happened for about 4 years and then stopped, up until the recording of this video, none of those nations have attacked each other militarily. It brought about goodwill. It did, historically. It's there in the history books, and you can read about it. It's historical evidence that what Maitreya says is true. The principle of sharing will bring about justice and bring about peace. It's not a perfect peace, but it wasn't tried for very long. And I always ask myself, and I try to ask this to you guys that are listening to this, the two questions are, will the nations that participated in the Marshall Plan, will they continue to have peace and trust amongst those nations if we don't eventually re-up and try it again? I would say the answer is no. Eventually, at some point, there would be a war between those nations at some point. Hopefully I'm wrong, but up until this point, it hasn't happened. That's the good news. The other thing is, what if the United States had tried it with other nations rather than just the Western European nations? What if we would have tried it with Russia? We would have had a Cold War. If we tried it in Central and South America, would we have had the conflict in the 80s, with the Honduras and Nicaragua? Would we have had those conflicts? If we had done it in Southeast Asia, would we have had the Vietnam War? Would we have had the Korean War? If we had done it in the Middle East, would we have had all the conflicts that we had in the Middle East, in between Palestine and Israel, between Israel and Iran, between Iran and the United States? Would we have all these conflicts, all this terrorism going on? Or would we be living in a totally different world? Would we even had 9/11 had we tried it with other nations? Even if we stopped it, even if we had stopped it in the 50s, just as we did before, if they had done it with those other nations, and it brought about trust amongst those nations that participated in it, it stands to reason that we would have trusted those nations too. But we didn't. We only did it with those nations, right? That's the sad news. The good news is there is a plan of peace. There is a way to bring about peace. And if you're somebody who's concerned about the world today, concerned about the environment, concerned about peace, perhaps study the Marshall Plan. Perhaps look at what Maitreya is saying. Read more about this, the principle of sharing in Ben's Masters articles. You get a better sense of it. See if it's true for you, right? And then start talking about it amongst your friends. The things that our presidents have promised, and Trump's not the only one that's guilty of this. Every one of the presidents since the inception of the Pentagon have all promised that their Pax Americana policy will bring about peace and security, and it never has. Just as what's going on today with Trump promising that it will bring about justice amongst these nations and these trading partners, and in a way, he's not using those terms, but that's basically what he's saying. It's not going to bring about justice. It's not going to bring about an ease of tensions between nations. It's only going to do the exact opposite, because that's all it's ever done. A tree is known by its fruit. Couldn't be simpler the way that Jesus put it. And you can apply it to anything. You can apply it to foreign policies of nations, right? You can apply it to domestic policies of nations. Is it going to bring about peace? When George W. Bush said, all we have to do is attack Afghanistan and Iraq and we will be free of terror. Did it do that? It did not. It did not end all wars. It only destabilized peace. So the question is, when are we going to try this? And we're not going to do it until we see the absolute necessity to do this. As a world, we're not going to do it. The good news is that Maitreya is going to be the voice for the principle of sharing. He's going to explain it in a way to not only the people, but to the world leaders, just how important it is. And I guarantee you, he will eventually say exactly what he said before. Without sharing, there will be no justice. Without justice, there will be no peace. And without peace, there will be no future. So we can only, at this point, study about it, learn about it, see if there's truth to us for ourselves, and talk about it and share about it amongst our friends. And if you don't know how peace will give us a future, okay, so there's two ways that we can end life on this planet if we do not start to cooperate with one another. We stop competing against one another, and we bring about trust amongst nations, right? The first is militarily, okay? So we have the ability to destroy all life on our planet through nuclear missiles, right? And according to the masters, eventually what would happen if we do not implement the principle of sharing, eventually there will be a war, whether it's within a nation or between two nations, that will eventually involve all the nations and will be nuclear and will end life on this planet at a stroke. The other thing that might be something that's not on people's radar is the environment and how important it is, and it's a necessity that nations learn to cooperate with one another. If we don't learn to cooperate with one another, we're never going to tackle the environmental problem. Well, that's going to cause us problems in the future if we don't do that too, which could end life on this planet. So there's two ways that we could really end life on this planet if we don't try the principle of sharing. That's why it's so important. So if you're somebody who's deeply concerned with the manifestation of peace and justice around the world, well, look at the principle of sharing. Look at what it did in the Marshall Plan with these nations. Nations like the United States, like I said, Italy, France, West Germany, England, and like I said, the United States. If you're deeply concerned about the environment, ask yourself, are we going to be able to solve this problem in time if we are still competing against one another? Or are nations going to have to learn to trust one another just a little bit more? But if you think that the tariffs that Trump is slapping on nations is going to bring about trust amongst the nations, you're living in la-la land. It's going to do the exact opposite. So anyway, now, moving on. Is it going to bring about a stock market crash? Well, the stock market crash is going to happen no matter what, whether Trump is in office or not in office. Will it accelerate the situation? It might. You know what I'm saying? It's not doing the markets any good for all intents and purposes. But something to consider and something to think about, something that I don't really have any evidence to really point to other than the other predictions that Maitreya made at the time did come true, like the ending of communism, the ending of the Cold War, the release of Nelson Mandela, which he made those same predictions around the same time, all came to pass. The ending of apartheid in South Africa. But he made a prediction back in the 80s that the stock market was going to crash. And it did to some degree. And he said it was going to start in Japan and move its way around the world. And at the time that he made that prediction, the Nikkei, which is the stock market in Japan, was at a very high. And then it went down like so far that it could have been said that it did collapse. Now what happened was, and this is something to also look at, everything is made up of energy, according to these masters. And we'll learn more about this as we start to learn from these masters in the future, just how much all in life is energy and the truth of that statement. But when the Cold War ended, that energy that was used to build up all the militaries on the East and the West, right, between Russia and versus the United States, he said it circled the world to find a new womb, W-O-M-B, to find a new womb. And it went around the world several times, and it landed into the stock markets. And what happened right after the ending of the Cold War is the stock markets started to go to these higher highs and higher highs. I don't know what the Dow was at in the 80s, but it was probably about 1,000 to 2,000. Now it's about 40-something thousand. Of course, it's gone down a little bit in the last few weeks since Trump has threatened to do tariffs and all that kind of stuff, and now he's following through on it. It's going down even more. But it got lifted up, and it got propped up. And according to Ben's master, it was a direct result of the forces of darkness that were doing this, putting money into the stock market, and their agents in government and in companies and in Wall Street and so forth. These agents that are working either consciously or unconsciously with the forces of darkness were doing this to prop it up. Now, in 2008, the stock market did collapse to some degree, but it didn't collapse all the way. That's the issue. And Ben's master made another prediction at that time that if it just is allowed to collapse and follow through on its collapse, that would be the end of it. We would learn our lesson. It would do exactly what Maitreya said, bring humanity to its knees, but also bring us to our senses. But he said if it wasn't allowed to collapse all the way, it would start to go to even higher highs, which it definitely did over the last, 17 years now? It's been that long. Jeez Louise. Or is it 17? No, it's like 18 years. Oh, yeah, 17 years. It's gone up to even higher highs. Now, the other bad news prediction that Ben's master said, if it does go to even higher highs, which it did, that the pain and the suffering that it will take to bring humanity to its knees and to its senses will be exponentially worse than it would have been had it just been allowed to collapse in 2008. So we got that to look forward to. How cool is that? But it will bring humanity to its senses. Now, somebody had commented and was making a prediction about 2025 being the year that Maitreya really is outknown for who he is. Couldn't want anything more than that, to be honest, for myself. Is that going to happen? I don't know. But I don't really make predictions in terms of time because everything's kind of fluid. But I do think, just as he said in this comment, that the stock market collapse will trigger people starting to recognize Maitreya more. I think Maitreya's, the tenor of his voice and his sense of urgency about the problems of the world and his wisdom and his love will be at such a tenor after the collapse of markets that it will be, as Ben's master put it, his head will be lifted above the horizon just enough to where we can see who he is and recognize him. If we don't know who Maitreya is, there will be people talking about it. Who is this extraordinary man saying these things, saying it very simply to where we can all kind of understand it, but yet speak for me, because this is what I've been thinking all along, that we should have been, but Maitreya that's his role for humanity, is to be the voice of humanity, to articulate it in such a clear way, in a very simple way, that it ignites the aspirations and the passions and the will of the people, to where not one government agency, not one government anywhere in the world can withstand the will of the people. And he will be the voice of those who have no voice. So anyway, I do think that we're headed in that direction. And I do think that just as Trump's steak and Trump vodka and Trump casinos and I don't know what other business ventures that he's had that failed, I think that this failed experiment of him running the country will probably bring about a stock market crash if we're lucky, And the reason I'm bringing it up is not to scare everybody, not to tell you to go to my Patreon channel and give me money so I can show you how you make money off this stock market crash, but to give you a little bit of hope that it might do exactly what Maitreya said it would do. It might bring us to our knees, but it's going to bring us to our senses. So anyway, now moving on to the other topic on the mouths of our pundits is AI. And why am I bringing this up now? Well, to hear people like Bill Gates, Elon Musk, others talk about AI and how disruptive it's going to be for the life of humanity over the next 5 to 10 years, you can have a really dystopian view of it. And it's understandable because these people that are saying these things don't really care about people. They don't care about anybody but themselves. They only care about their money in their pocket. Now, I know Bill Gates is a philanthropist, so I'm kind of putting him in a little different category, but the way he kind of made it sound in this interview, it didn't sound like he really gave a crap about anything other than this is going to happen. It's going to put about 98% of the workforce out of work. What do they think is going to happen? Do they think people are just going to sit back and do nothing? Or are they going to storm the castle? That's basically where we're at. But the good news about AI, and it's probably coming on when the technology is being developed, when Maitreya has already been out and the principle of sharing had already started, we'd have a different view of it. But right now, things are so commercial, right? There's so much competition amongst people and governments and groups and corporations that you can't help but be a little alarmed about it. But according to the masters, the purpose of automation is not to take over all of humanity. It's to free humanity up to discover who and what they are, which is the self, which is the next thing I want to talk about. So these so-called world leaders that talk about AI, when they're talking about it, I know it seems very dystopian and very frightening to hear what they're saying about it, but at the end of the day, once the principle of sharing is tried, once we try it, once we do it, automation will free humanity up to really discover who and what we are, discover our inner creativity, to help bring about harmony amongst nations and everything. And we just don't know, we can't see it because we're obviously living in the world that we're living in today. But the world that we'll be living in the very near future will be totally different than what we're living today. Because we have very wise, loving masters and elder brothers to show humanity how to build these structures, to how to beautify our cities, to how to create free travel for people to go from point A to point B, to learn different cultures. We'll be able to travel at a whim. We won't even have to pay for it. And we can travel anywhere in the world and at a moment's notice and be there in just a few hours or seconds or whatever and be able to experience what it's like to be in Paris and then go to South Africa and then go to Australia and be back by Monday. It'd be great. And then, even then, when you start your work day on Monday, you only have to work 2 days. And then you're off for the rest of the time. Learning what it's like to be you, being creative like only you can be creative, and that kind of thing. Learning what the self is like only you can learn how the self is. To listen to these masters and study the the ancient mysteries, as these masters will be teaching us. But this is all going to come from the technology that's there. And if you look at the generation that's coming up, they really are the generation that's going to show and set up future generations on how to live with a life of leisure. That's what we're seeing right now. We're seeing the conflicts between the two, and I know in my job, I see the conflicts between the two. A generation that wants to work really hard and make as much money as you can, and the other generation that really doesn't care about that. They only care about the free time. And that's where automation, I think, fits in. But these people that think that the world's just going to go on and we're just going to have the markets the way we are dreaming. The nations will have to learn how to take care of their people. They haven't done it. We didn't do it with COVID, with the lockdowns. We haven't done it when we've had other things go on. None of the nations around the world are really taking care of their people the way that they should. Maitreya says that the economically, it should be about 90% socialism, 10% capitalism. He says it like this: there are two wheels on the same cart. You can't have a cart and push a cart very well if you only have one wheel. You just go in a circle. And that's what we have today. We have more of the markets, we have more of capitalism than we have socialism. But at the end of the day, nations will have to learn how to take care of their people. There's the only way. These people are not going to just sit back and not be able to eat, not have a life for themselves, and watch all these people on TV just, until their cable gets shut off from lack of payment, watch all these people live their life and be happy and stuff. They're not going to do it. So as a necessity, eventually the nations of the world are going to have to shift their priorities to the people and not so much to themselves. So that's the good news. Okay, now, lastly, I want to talk about the self. I talked about it in the last video in terms of love. I read Romans 13, where Paul talks about if you truly love, you can't sin. You can't commit crimes. You can't lie. You can't commit murder or violence against somebody. And it's so true. And then somebody had listed out the different types of Greek distinctions of love, which is, it's always been there, and it's nice to read it, and it's nice to be able to distinguish between what love you're actually doing, right? But what I was talking about was not necessarily a love that we're used to talking about. It's more of understanding of yourself as the self. Maitreya says he comes to teach the art of self-realization. That's his purpose, really. And to do that, we have to have the structures available to support life and to bring about justice so that everybody can sit back, relax, and leisure, and really know themselves as the self. That's really our destiny. That's our purpose in life, is to realize ourselves as the self. And I was watching a podcast with Piers Morgan, of all people. He was talking with Neil deGrasse Tyson and asking him what was before the Big Bang. And Neil deGrasse Tyson said he didn't know what was before the Big Bang. And I do agree with both men who were talking about it. Yes, we don't know what was before the Big Bang. And then Piers Morgan said that that's how he knows there's an intelligence out there that he calls God, which I agree with too. I couldn't agree more. His view on God might be different than mine, but it doesn't matter. Yeah, there is an intelligence of God, right? But what was before the Big Bang, and this is what we talk about when we talk about the self, what was before the Big Bang was the absolute reality, the self. The only permanence in all of cosmos is the self. And it's the same absolute reality that's everything in cosmos that is consciousness. All that we see, all that we touch and feel and learn and grow is all in it, but it's not affecting it. It doesn't change anything about the self, the same self that was there before the Big Bang. And will be the same self that's around, unchanged, permanent, that is there after all of cosmos goes back in on itself, the divine breath. And will be the same self that's there the next time the Big Bang happens, and so forth and so forth and so forth. But that self can be realized. And when you realize yourself as the self, it is truly what Jesus said when he said that it's like discovering a treasure in a field. Would you not sell all your possessions to go buy that field, right? That treasure that he was talking about, I think he was talking about, was the self. There was a listener that listens to this channel, Ms. Ruby. She said she recognized a verse in the Bible, I think it was in Hebrews, the unshakable kingdom. That unshakable kingdom is the self. When Paul was talking about love. He was talking about when someone recognizes themselves as the self, they love thy neighbor as thyself. They fulfill the law. You don't have to follow the 10 Commandments. You don't have to believe anything. You just have to love. And the only way to truly love is to not intellectualize the different distinctions of love. It's to see yourself as the self. And the only way to do that, and this is what I'm going to leave the discussion with, is the teaching that Maitreya already gave us. He said to practice honesty of mind, sincerity of spirit, and detachment. To have what you think, what you say, and what you do all line up. We all think one thing, say something else, and do something entirely different. To recognize when we do it like that, and to try to get it to line up. And we're not going to do it perfectly the first time, not going to do it perfectly the second time, and you're not going to be able to sustain it without intentionally using your own will and practicing it. And then the other thing would be sincerity of spirit. To be in the moment, to forget all about the things that concern you about your life, your job, your kids, your bank account, and just be in the moment. It can be happening when you're driving the car on a nice day. It can be happening when you're sitting on a beach. It could be happening when you're having a conversation with somebody. It could be happening when you're listening to the music that you love. It could be happening when you're creating the music that you want to create. It could be happening when you're looking at a painting that you love. It can be happening while you're painting. It could be happening when you're serving. It can happen at any moment, at any time. But you have to recognize when you're in that moment and the sincerity of spirit, and hold yourself there as long as you can. And then when you're not there and you're ruminating and you're worried and you're anxious, to try to go back into it. It's a form of meditation, really. And then the third thing, which is probably the most difficult because it takes the most objectivity and the most bravery and the most courage to do, is to be detached. Ask yourself not, why am I mad? But ask yourself, who is mad? If you're feeling great and everything is fine and wonderful, ask yourself, who is feeling this? It's not you. You're what's witnessing it. And when you detach yourself, you start to see, as it's been described, is you start to see kind of something, you feel something behind you, watching you. That behind you and watching you and all around you is the self. But Piers Morgan actually asked the question, and he was asking, what is that space that allowed all this to exist and be created? That space is the self. Inquire about it, think about it, practice it, fail it. That's what we should all be doing. Every one of these masters do this perfectly. They've identified 100% of the time with the self, not with the little self, but with all of the self, with that absolute reality. But I guarantee you, if we could go back in time, every one of those masters, the first time they heard about the self, in their own way, in their own language, went, yeah, right, whatever. And went on to the next thing. And then they heard about it again in another life and went, yeah, whatever. And then they heard about it in another life, yeah, whatever. And then finally, at some point, they took a step and started to learn it within themselves, to start to recognize it within themselves, to start to try to identify themselves as that. And it changes everything. And once you start to see yourself as the self, you do several things, but one of the things is you start to love unconditionally at the moment that you realize yourself as a self. You can't not love unconditionally. First of all, love others as thyself. But the second thing is you're never the same after that. When you are not experiencing yourself or identifying yourself as the self, something's off within you. And then when you realize yourself as a self, by practicing honesty of mind, sincerity of spirit, and detachment, all is right in the world. And then when you start to notice that you're off, you got to go back and do it again. You got to go back and do it again. And you got to go back and do it again. And that's why I'm bringing this up. It's important for us to start thinking about. It's important for us to start looking at. It's important for us to start practicing. Because it's the only thing that will bring about love in the world, really, is to know yourself as the self, and not as Little Miss Personality or Mr. Personality. I love you guys very much. Thank you very much for listening, and I look forward to talking to you again in future videos. Have a wonderful rest of your day. Remember to take action and help SOP save our planet. Thanks for listening, and we look forward to talking to you again in future videos.